Carson, Leno, Fallon. Now, it's Wine Talks with Paul K.
Hey, welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are in studio today in beautiful Southern California, about to have a conversation with Monsieur Romik Arconian of Chateau Canon Chaigneau in the Lalande de Pommerol district of Bordeaux. Introductions in just a moment. Wine Talks sponsored by this episode by Total Wine & More, where you find what you love and love what you find. Always available on Spotify, Shopify. No, that's not right. Always available on Spotify, Apple Play, Google Play, wherever you hang out for podcasting. Wine Talks is there. Hey, this is a great conversation for me because it covers a lot of bases. And welcome to the show, Romik.
Thank you.
And the reason it covers a lot of bases for me is, one, it's our heritage. We're Armenian, and we're interested in wine. Number two, number three, I'm a Francophile by trade because of my father. So we're covering a lot of bases today. But tell me about your trek, Romik. You own a chateau in Bordeaux.
That's right. So I'm actually originally, I was born in England to mixed parents. My mother's English, my dad is Armenian. My dad was actually born in Calcutta, but I spent the first 20 or so years of my life in England, and I basically left to do my third year of university, so 22 odd years ago. Moved to Paris for a year, fell in love with the city, the culture, the lifestyle. And long story short is I started a wine business in Paris in the late 90s, which I subsequently sold about 5 years ago. And then took the plunge and bought a vineyard, basically to stay in the industry. Bought Canon Chaigneau coming on 3 years ago, which is a beautiful property on the Nayak Plateau, just in Lalande de Pommerol. We're just about a kilometre north of the Pommerol Plateau, which is where a lot of the very great Pommerol Chateau are situated.
Tell me about this idea that you there's something about the French lifestyle that in Paris in general, that when somebody visits, it's a city of lights, it's prettier in the rain, those kinds of concepts. In fact, when I feel like really departing from a day's work, I watch A Midnight in Paris, which is an unbelievable sort of recap of the Paris lifestyle, and particularly from the Belle Epoque and those eras. So what was it that drew you to Paris when you first moved there, and then what drew you to opening a wine business, and what kind of wine business was it?
It's obviously a beautiful, sensational city, architecturally, culturally, gastronomically. I mean, all the reasons that everyone falls in love with Paris. I fell in love with Paris too. The women, the wine, the food, the architecture. It's mind blowing, especially as a 22-year-old student. I was working in a bar. Part-time student, part-time, and I basically ended up saying to myself, I prefer Paris to London, I prefer France to England, and started a fine wine business with an ex-business partner, basically specializing in top-end Bordeaux and vintage Burgundy, the top producers of the world, basically, at a time where I guess it was easier to do that because it was wine searcher, pre-internet almost, where there was less barriers to entry and I guess less visibility on price mechanisms and supply. So we had the run almost of all the private sellers and the various Burgundy producers in the late 90s before things really took off and were very sort of fashionable in terms of Burgundy. And that was great. It was a great business. As I say, we did a lot of export. We did a lot of importing as well, imported a few domains to France and distributed those, sold a little bit on the internet. And then I basically had the opportunity to sell the company. My dream, like a lot of people again, was to have my own vines, my own single supplier. Only one supplier as such, rather than 50, 100, 200, 500 suppliers, less inventory, less logistics. So I knew of the wines of Chateau Canon Chaigneau. I always had appreciated them. for their terroir, because there's it's a great terroir up in Lalande de Pommerol. They're really singular wines with a sort of the same limestone, clay, iron deposits. Great terroirs that you get, as I say, just to the south of Pommerol. And I found out the vineyard was for sale, and I took the plunge, basically, as I say, about 3 years ago.
Let me back up a minute to this idea that you were selling high-end Burgundies. Of course, most enophiles and just will say, all leads read. Did I say something? All roads lead to Burgundy when it comes to the study of wine and the complexities and the ideas, and Burgundy being such a dramatically different part of the world than Bordeaux. Would you think that business that you were running then, A, is it still running, and B, how much different do you think it is in the changes in our industry that have happened the last even 5 years?
Yeah, the business is still running. It's a good company called Grand Cru Paris. I sold it to Matthew de Costa of the Fleur Cardinal family, his parents own Fleur Cardinal. He's doing a great job. He's still selling fine wine. It has become more difficult because I think, obviously in terms of allocations and in terms of worldwide demand, it means that allocations for everyone are going down. I mean, as I say, in the noughties as such, and even 10 years ago, we were getting allocations 5 times larger than we were getting even 5 years ago. It's insane. It's got more and more difficult, and that was indeed one of the reasons why I wanted to look at. I mean, I knew what else was out there. I know you get sort of terroir-driven complexity in all sorts of appellations, across the Loire, in the Rhone Valley. I guess Pinot Noir does have that malleability and capacity to absorb complexity, I suppose, easier and more obviously than other grapes. But I think there's great complexity to be had in regions across the world, indeed, of course. And the prices are and scarcity with what they are in Burgundy. I've just almost had enough of it, and this was like on 10 years ago, 5 years ago. I think I was relieved to be able to get such complexity, indeed, in such good value in the vineyard that I managed to purchase. If that makes sense.
I totally agree with you. I think that's important. I think what's lost in many regions of the world are the consumerism of wine has directed a lot of these brands, and particularly store brands, into some sort of this monolithic character that people seem to enjoy. But when you can jump on a wine like Chateau Chaigneau, where you start to sense the complexities of the terroir, it's very important. But I think the real question would have to be, you were in the retail side of things, you were buying from many, many vendors, and you understood all the ramifications. And a lot of people would say, why the hell would you get into making wine and want to bite that up?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it was a little bit of a scattershot, harebrained idea, especially as we did it right when COVID was getting going. July 2020 was when we signed for the vineyard, and we could have, I think we could have pulled out because of that, but we didn't. We went through with it, and it has been extremely difficult because obviously distributors and importers haven't been wanting to take on new product because they haven't done enough with existing producers and existing portfolios, and in many respects it was a very stupid thing to do. But no, I do absolutely believe in the quality and the quality of the wine, and I think it honestly is one of the best value wines that exist in Planet Wine today. As I say, we've got complexity, singularity, drinkability, all the things that people do look for in a fine wine, and it's at a very entry level price as such.
Wines are very good. We're going to talk about the distribution worldwide, but COVID was an important part of our industry for a lot of reasons. One, the retail side, our sector did really, really well, and then it's been miserable since then because of online. But at the same time, while you guys suffered through getting it into the channels at a very difficult time, has that freed up a little, and you're starting to see a loosening of the supply chain and people come into the
certainly.
table.
Absolutely. So no, we're getting more and more. We're getting more and more distributors. We're getting more and more sales. Sales are we've sold as much this year as we did in the whole of last year, all of last year. So no, things are up nicely. We also do D2C. We sell direct on our website. So, but we also sell to importers in the US. We've got a good importer in the UK. We've got a good distributor in France. The French market's very, very important to us. And as I say, I have great faith in the quality of our product. Our distributors come back for more as such. I didn't quite realize to what extent you had to get a distributor on board, an importer on board, and then they have to get their clients on board too. And then those clients also have to get those clients on board. So I didn't quite realize, having worked in the fine wine business, how long things take for people to, get the wine onto people's tables and into people's glasses.
That's an interesting point, because you did come from sort of a captive environment, having the finer wines, the Burgundies and the Bordeaux and the later vintages, older vintages. And all of a sudden you're into sort of a price range where you're competing with a lot of different things, and you're a different side of the business. And so, yes, that the tiering has to happen. But it sounds like, things are changing on your side. And I've seeing it change here. But you made an interesting point. And part of the post, man, I am swapping letters today and making no sense. Part of the post-COVID revelations here in America for distributors was that, wow, we ought to think about getting into the DTC market, the direct to consumer, for the listeners, where you circumvent the 2 or 3 levels of commission, so to speak, that normally would go into it, and you can sell the wine direct for retail. I think most of the distributors that thought maybe they ought to do this have backed off of it, because it is a totally different business in America to be a direct to consumer marketeer versus a supplier of wine to a distributor who gets it on the shelf. Is that, I'm going to assume it's the same in France and other parts of the world for you?
Well, we do a little bit of D2C by obligation as much as anything. We've got to get wine out of the door, and we find consumers are almost an easier target because they buy into our story than retailers and distributors. And what we obviously do is we allocate a small advertising budget into our prices online, which allows us to advertise and almost buy consumers. But I think in France, it's not quite as prevalent as it is in the States. I mean, I think, a lot of Sonoma and Napa and Californian producers only almost do D2C. I could be completely wrong, but it seems to be their modus operandi as such to do that straight off the bat. Whereas in France, it's much more through the traditional channels. I mean, I guess there's a bit of everything, isn't there, in that respect? But as I say, for us, we need to make sales more, and we're doing it to get the wine into people's glasses as such, not as much as out of choice as such.
I think, France obviously is a different marketplace, Europe in general, but certainly in California, it's necessary because, and maybe I forgot what is the retail sort of shelf price for Chateau Canon Chaigneau in the market?
It's a mouthful, isn't it? That's the other thing. So between about $30 and $40 dollars.
Okay, so that's the position.
So it's a competitive market. A little bit less for our second wine. We also do an unoaked wine, which is probably between about $25 and $30, but around $30. So it's competitive, but good value and popular price point.
How did you get driven to Lalande de Pommerol in the first place? So here you are selling wine in France. Obviously, we talked about that, the Burgundies and the Bordeaux and the different vintages, and buying a chateau in Bordeaux. They're for sale, like on a regular, immobilier business.
I mean, again, we did look at the south of France, and you don't get much good value down there. You don't get any, it's expensive down there. You basically, it's difficult to make a business as such down there, because you're paying for the lifestyle, you're paying for the land and the property more than the actual vineyard. So no, as I say, I knew the wines of Canon Chaigneau. I thought they were sort of great value. I wanted to make a real proper wine, and it was a vineyard which was for sale for not much more than the actual price of the vine. So we weren't sure whether we wanted to live down there. Actually, to be perfectly frank, it wasn't we're still living in Paris at the moment. I love the wine. I love the wine. I think it's remarkably good value. I think it's honestly the best $30 that you can spend on a bottle of wine, and so by extension, I thought it'd be an easy sale and a good business to be able to run and get into more people's glasses as such, which hasn't proved to be the case.
But use it all.
Completely wrong, Paul.
There you go, thinking again.
Yeah, I think, as I say, it will prove to be
I think so.
A successful.
I think in the wine world, if you know, the product has to be good in the first place. I mean, it sounds like, and I know the wines are very good.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. Because you could have done it anywhere, but if you don't really and truly believe in the wines, then I think it's going to be more difficult. And it's difficult, obviously, to buy a pre-established winery with a real track record where there's nothing to do as such. And if you do that, ideally, I'd have liked to buy a hectare of Montrachet, and bottled it and sold it. But it's just obviously completely impossible unless you're willing to drop.
What is the history of Chateau Canon Chaigneau? I mean, established when?
So people have been making wines on that plot for well over 2,000 years, Paul.
Wow.
It's so we're right up on the plateau where we are. The top of the hill as such, where it's easier to make good wine. There's better drainage. We're in a spot where there hasn't been any hail, I think, for over 50 years. And when there was hail 50 years ago, it was like a spot, and people almost joke about it today. We don't get much frost. We've got a beautiful vineyard, which is fairly easy to manage because of the great terroir of being at the top of the hill. As I say, people chose to grow grapes there and not, a few hundred meters down the road, because it's easier and the terroir also makes lovely complex wines as such. So that was that the wines weren't always bottled under the Canon Chaigneau label. I think the Canon Chaigneau label started about 150 or so years ago. It was slightly smaller. And the previous owner's parents bought it in the late 50s as Canon Chaigneau. They worked the brand. They were selling quite a lot of wine to under a second label. Similar quality, but to a second label to French supermarkets. So we're trying to cut that out and put everything in bottle under Canon Chaigneau, because it's a very homogeneous terroir. It's a really good sort of terroir, which, as I say, does afford to make good wines as such, I guess.
Isn't that interesting that, that 2,000 years worth? And I have this, my latest sort of rant and theory on wine is so much of it is about that history, even though you weren't around and your family wasn't around. But the fact that this land was growing grapes, that there's a history to that, it fascinates me like no other product, right?
Absolutely. And I think the wisdom of our forefathers as such, whereby that they knew where the best places to grow which grapes is something that's often forgotten. It's the same for going back to Burgundy, the Grand Crus of Burgundy, the Côte d'Or, even the village wines around there. They've been growing vines there for since the Roman times as well. So, and it was, as I say, I could be completely wrong, but I think it was ease of growing in the, climatic conditions made growing easy, and also gave great quality and complexity to the wine. So I think it's those two factors that meant that the select regions were chosen rather than others, as I say. And I mean, there are parts of Saint-Emilion which today have Grand Cru status, but they are in sort of in on lower lands, and they are much more impacted by frost, for example, and they are vineyards where people haven't been growing vines for very long, and you can sort of see why, because they're lower, the runoff, the drainage isn't as good, and it's more difficult to make wine there as such.
The monks, there were monks. The church was in Bordeaux as well as it has.
Yeah.
Burgundy. Stories are there. I think a lot of when I had this conversation, it ends up that, hey, all they had was time on their hands, right? So they were able to sort of, without technology and without, evaluation metrics, just by the sheer volume of grapes, the quality of the grapes they're getting, they could analyze and decide where the better vineyards were. And I think that's so much of what we do that is lost in what's being consumed, and that history. And we'll go to Armenia right now with this conversation, because you're talking about landing some business in Armenia. And I had the story about one of the Armenian vineyards, and Michel Roland himself said, okay, yeah, grapes will grow here, and being a new industry for that country, but it'll take 100 years to figure it out. And here you have vineyards like yours that are 2,000 years old, right? So that's what it takes.
Well, I thought Armenians at least claimed that Armenia was one of the sort of original birthplaces of
course,
red wine, at least. But again, it's not everywhere, is it? It's I think in only certain select parts of the country.
Like many other countries, they got the Soviets stepped in and redirected who was going to do what. But the point I'm making is that here you have a vineyard in Bordeaux that's 2,000 years old, that even though we don't have people that remember that, and the stories may have not been brought forward, just the fact that grapes have grown in this area bring to the table something that isn't brought to the table in other places until those times catch up, because it is about the time, and it is about the history, about what's there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there is that sort of heritage, I suppose is the word. And as I say, the sort of the know-how of our predecessors and proves that they were right as such. But it's fascinating. I mean, there are obviously wineries that do establish themselves in Europe and more recent places, and who are equally successful. But as I say, I love the fact that we do have that history and that heritage going back that long time.
You said something important, and I play with this a little bit. The term successful in the wine business, I think by all modern extensions, even non-modern extensions, success would be, wow, I sell a lot, or I make a lot of money doing it. And I wonder if the idea of success was different in the world of wine, which would be redefined as saying, I have created the best wine available to me based on this terroir, this vintage, all the things that go into making a bottle of wine, rather than I've sold a lot.
Yeah, no, that was, and also in terms of price, because as I say, so just going back, when I was a fine wine merchant, we sold an awful lot of very expensive bottles, and it sort of bothered me that a lot of collectors don't look at wines. Everyone wants to be spending 500 to 1,000, not everyone obviously, but there's a certain demographic of wine buyer who will only be looking at wines between 500 and plus a bottle. And I often found myself thinking, that's all very well, but anyone can buy or even indeed make a wine at that price point, and for it to be good. It's more of a challenge to sort of make or buy or gift wines that cost 30, 40 or even less euros a bottle, dollars a bottle, that can compete blind as such, or be as singular or interesting or pleasurable than obviously bottles at 10, 20 times the price. And that's not wanting to bang on about it, but that's what I do love about Canon Chaigneau, because they are sort of wines that do offer a real sort of bang for buck and pleasure, and complexity, but they are, silly amounts of money. And often, when you do drink very expensive fine wines, and people do know the price tags or don't know the price tags, people end up thinking, oh, well, was that actually really worth it? And that's the sort of big letdown of spending regularly that sort of amount of money on a bottle of wine, because indeed it is only a bottle of wine, and the major part of wine is obviously it being alcoholic and pleasurable, and nothing more, nothing less, and as long as it's like a cold beer or whatever, if it's good and cold and nice and makes you feel good, that's half of the job as such as well.
But I agree with that completely. And yes, we tend not to talk about the 14% or 13% alcohol about the wine that adds to the enjoyment of the bottle. But the other day I was trying to explain to a friend about the difference in some wines based on the price, and I said, regardless of the price, when anybody that even a novice that approaches wine tastes a properly made wine, and I call that now my new words, an honest glass of wine. People laugh when I say that, but I mean that in its entirety, in that the source of the grapes, the manufacturing of the wine is just an honest presented procedure, trying to present to the consumer the best that it can produce. And I tell them, even you would recognize, whether it was from the Canary Islands or from Bordeaux or from Burgundy or from Napa, a properly made wine, most people are going to agree, makes them feel something. Something happens because it's not hiding things. It's not shielded by stuff. It's just properly made. You may not like the character, but you'll understand its structure. And I think that's a very important part of what we do. What's interesting, and you buy this chateau in Lalande de Pommerol, and you can afford to sell a bottle of wine retail for $30 or $40 and make the margins you need to do. If you and I tried that same scenario today in Napa Valley, the minimum we could charge would be somewhere around $120 a bottle, maybe $100 if we're really lucky, based on the price of the real estate. And
is the price per hectare that expensive now? I guess
it's just minimum, and the price. I think grapes are can be upwards to $10,000 to $15,000 a ton, and that just forces you into the bottle at $100 to $150. And we're not necessarily producing a wine any better or better value than what you're doing automatically.
Yeah, well, that's the way the market is, I suppose. I mean, I do think that France does have I think in France there's this very rich country in terms of agricultural land per capita. I think it has the most agricultural land per capita of any country in Europe and indeed in the world, and that obviously makes prices relatively cheap. I mean, I know people ask me about English wine. It's exactly the same thing. You can make really good English wine, but English wine needs to be made in Southeast England. And Southeast England, to buy, a hectare of land is extremely expensive. So yeah, English wine can be great too, but you're not going to get great value there. Whereas in the Loire Valley, and in Languedoc, and you can buy a hectare of land, I think, for 10 to 15,000 euros for a hectare, which will give you 6,000 to 8,000 bottles a year. So you can almost buy the land for.
Don't entice me there, Romik.
You do the math. It's just like literally.
Yeah, I'm driving down there when we're in Paris next week and taking a look or driving over there. And
that's planted, by the way. That's
oh my God,
by planted, and I think it does cost. I mean, I could be. I could be completely wrong, but I think someone told me the other day it costs up almost 20,000 euros to plant per hectare or something ridiculous nowadays.
Well, that would be what would that be, around 10 to 12,000 per acre? Putting in California numbers.
Yeah.
My wife and I in 2000, I think early 2000s, 3 or 4, we bought 60 acres in Paso Robles, which is a burgeoning and well-known great district of California.
Yeah.
And we bought it thinking we were going to plant it and retire, but it ended up being $15,000 an acre to plant it. This is many years ago. So it's probably a little more now, but you're talking $1 million.
Yeah.
When I can't remember what I paid for it, but it wasn't anywhere near that. And so the planting cost was going to be, 6-7 times what the land cost was. So we eventually, and then we realized we kill everything. We do not have green thumbs, and we ended up selling it. And I think there's a vineyard on it now. It was also during the glut in California when people weren't even picking if they didn't have a contract. So let's move to the business side a little bit, because the lifestyle, the romantic part of you're of course now in Paris, but there's a whole point of doing this project because you want that lifestyle. You want to be part of, particularly in Napa Valley, where if you made a lot of money and you're going to build that chateau and you're going to show off to your friends, and you find out, there's really business, right? I mean, we're farmers, you're farmers by trade, but eventually the romance is over and we need to sell some wine and get it to different markets. And you were just talking about having some great distributors in America. How has that been post-COVID to get your name in a book, what we call a book in the world of wine, which is the wholesale book? So the salesperson walks into that wine shop or that restaurant and says, here's my book, anything you want to buy. How has that been, that process?
It's been extremely, extremely difficult. Yeah. So, I mean, people, as I say, I think people were loath to take anyone new on during COVID, and post-COVID, people have been reticent as well to take anyone on because, as I said, they don't think they've done enough business with their existing clients, I guess, but suppliers and such. But we've got the wines with Maverick, the Maverick Group, who are in 6 states: Florida, Minnesota, Colorado, Texas, Illinois, and I forget the last one. We've got the wines with the company called WineWise in California, who are in San Francisco. We've got some wines lying with the Wine Trust in New York. It's a slow, drawn-out process because, as I say, you can get the wines with people stateside, but then they've got to get the wines to their clients as such, which means it just takes an awful long time, I think. I mean,
there has been a lot of consolidation in America post-COVID with some smaller. I mean, it seems like with a chateau like yours, to put your wines in like Southern or Young's or RNDC, you just get buried by the pages and pages of wines people are offering, and you have to compete with bringing to the sales force a free trip to Hawaii or to Bordeaux because they sold 5 cases. And so here you have smaller distributors that do have sales forces that will put the wine in front of their clients. And I think for the listeners, I wanted to emphasize that this process, it takes time. You're also dealing with the fact you've got a vintage to move, that you want to make sure it gets into the hands of the people before the next vintage gets bottled. And so this whole process starts over again every 12 months. It's a bit of a task. It's a bit of a juggling act to get it done.
Absolutely.
How did you end up in Armenia then? I mean, we just got done with Guinea Fest here in Los Angeles, and it's grown to be this pretty amazing thing. I think you need to be here, or Maverick needs to be here the next time. It's once a year. There's probably 75 booths.
Really?
They're California-owned wineries that are owned by Armenians, as well as many wineries from Armenia displaying their goods through the various distributors that are around. And I think it would be beneficial.
When was it, you say? It was just now?
It just occurred about 3 weeks ago. I had 3 Armenian winemakers in for the podcast just afterwards. I'll get you the contact information. Andres Garibian and the Stepan Partamyan, 2 people that run it. But it's turned into not only a great expose of Armenian wines, whether they're diaspora wines or indigenous, but it's also great for Armenians I think about 2,000 people show up to this thing. So, I mean,
wow.
They're doing a lot, but why did you think it was important to get your wines into Armenia? Is it because of your heritage, or because you just thought it was a great marketplace because it's growing?
All of those, I guess. It is growing. It's a very buoyant market with all the Russians, I think, that are fleeing their country. I think it's nice for me as an Armenian and for Armenians to see an Armenian owning a Bordeaux chateau as well. We do have my name proudly at the bottom in small print of the bottle, Romik Arconian, and I think I think that sort of appeals obviously to an Armenian market. But I think any market appreciates the wine. And as I say, we're working with a company called Artex in Armenia who supply a lot of the hotels, restaurants, and wine shops. We've got into some.
Well, I can tell you, we were there 2006 or 7, I can't remember, and I had this conversation yesterday with the USC Institute of Armenian Studies. Really, it was undrinkable in just 16 years ago. Yeah, just literally undrinkable. And of course, the Armenian sort of pride, you have to say it's really good. So here I am tasting these wines, and literally the concrete fermentation tanks are patched up with like Henry's, roof repair, and we're drinking this stuff, and it's gone through second fermentation. So it's terrible, and you can't drink it. But you look at the guy and you say, "Wow, this is really good," in my broken Armenian. And now, because they have modern technologies and there's still a bit of pride in growing. This is an interesting question for you. I'm going to ask. Not growing non-Armenian varietals. So they want to stick with Arani and Sireni and Voskahat and all these different indigenous grapes. Granted, they're ancient grapes. I mean, it's kind of like Umbria in Italy, right? Where there's all these amazing old grapes. What would happen if we brought Armenian indigenous varietals to France? Do you think anybody would care?
I think so. I think there's a whole swathe of people who are fascinated by ancient and rare grape varieties. I mean, it's obviously not a huge market, but again, I think it does go back to people trying and testing which varieties do work best into various which soils. I mean, people really do it. I mean, I wasn't aware. I know, and people love doing this sort of analysis. I know a winery in Alicante in Spain, Valencia in Spain, and the winemaker there and their team, they've planted, I think, over 100 grapes, and the guy every year tests what works best in terms of flavor profile and in terms of growing. And I think people have done that work, and they've done it historically, and I think there are sort of probably, wine geeks around the world probably still experimenting and doing that sort of work. But going back, I think in terms of Armenian wine, I think in many respects that it was so damn awful, being honestly, because they just were making wine.
They were really bad.
But I mean, they were almost doing everything to make bad wine. They were doing it at the lowest price point possible. They were bleeding the ground. They were making, they were making it for the equivalent of under €1 a litre. They were, absolutely sweating everything out of the ground. They were making probably the equivalent of 15,000 bottles per hectare. So it was just this, and for no money at all in sort of very basic winemaking facilities. And so I don't think it was the fault of the terroir or the grape variety or even the winemaker. It was just probably the financial constraints of what they were having to do to be able to sell the wine at the price point that was being offered to them. And even if probably someone said to them, well, actually, just make half the amount of wine that you've been making, and I'm going to pay you €2 a bottle for it, they'd have made something, much, much better. It was just the sort of, the constraints in terms of price and economics that made the wine not very good. If you see what I mean, it was their obligations to their customers in terms of price.
I agree with that. I totally agree. Let me take a break and talk about Total Wine and More, where you find what you love and love what you find. Distilled spirits are not available in North Carolina or Virginia, and you must be 21 or old to buy at Total Wine and More. I was there not too long ago, and they had this Prosecco aisle, and there's Proseccos for $8, which is a great alternative to champagnes and other sparkling wines, as the English wine we spoke about earlier. And rosé, being the hot product in Southern California, of course, and across America, is under $7 in many cases. But Total Wine, the sponsor of the show, have a visit. I think you'll be intrigued. And like I said, you will love what you find and find what you love at Total Wine. I pulled this document off. You sent me an email October 13th, 2022. And it says here, 2022 has been, of course, one of the hottest and driest on record. In our humble opinion, it is not really a vintage that should be defined as either left or right bank. Indeed, with global warming creating even more trials to confound wine producers, requiring over increasing yield to overcome. Yield, I don't know that word. But there's an overwhelming advantage of being on one side of the river, the other. So I thought that was an interesting comment, and I want you to explain it. In our humble opinion, it is not really a vintage that should be defined as either left or right bank.
Yeah, I mean, I find journalists are always there and everyone's sort of waiting with bated breath. Is it left bank vintage? Is it a right bank vintage? But as I say, I just think these, especially in very difficult vintages or very hot vintages, that there's so many other criteria that can affect the quality and the outcome of the success or failure of a wine in a vintage than simply whether it's on one side of the river or the other, or whether they have a majority of Cabernet or Merlot or the other. Then that to say it's left bank or right bank is just simplifying things a little bit. And
that's kind of interesting. That's interesting. For the listeners, like the general broad strokes, left bank wines are Cabernet based and right bank wines are Merlot based. And I think that's, you're trying to define that. And it says, actually, the title of the article is Greetings from Nayac. And you brought it up early in the conversation, but Nayac is a smaller, plots of land inside Lalande de Pommerol.
Yeah. So it's a sub. It used to be its own appellation, actually, Nayac. It used to be called Nayac Pommerol. And back, I think, in the 30s, the winemakers of Nayac had the choice as to whether to join Lalande de Pommerol, and I think they even might have had a choice to join Pommerol itself, and they plumped for Lalande, and the rest is history as such, because obviously Pommerol has gone on to become slightly more fashionable and sought after than Lalande de Pommerol. But Lalande de Pommerol and Pommerol are basically split north to south by a river called the Barban, very small stream river. And to the south is Pommerol and to the north is Lalande de Pommerol. But in many respects, the appellations should almost be divided east to west, because on the east side of both appellations, Lalande and Pommerol, you get very clay limestone soils, and that's where the Pommerol Plateau is, and the Nayac Plateau on the east side of both appellations. And then to the west of both appellations, you get more sandy, gravelly soils. So in that respect, the actual appellations don't do a very good job of defining the flavor profiles or the different characteristics of the regions as such, which is in essence what an appellation should really do. But that's just the way it is. But no, Nayac is more similar in terms of terroir to the east side of Pommerol.
That's an interesting point. It's a tough point, particularly in the Bordeaux side of things. Like we were talking about Pinot Noir a little bit being more malleable is the word you use too. It's terroir. And so if you're growing two plots of Pinot Noir across the street from each other and you use the same winemaker and the same barrels, you probably can draw some conclusions as to what the differences are in the terroir. And we talked about the monks sort of figuring it out on their own. But when you start blending wines like we do in Bordeaux, you probably do start to blur some of the differences in the terroir, but certainly they're there. I was just reading Michael Broadbent's tasting book on Bordeaux, and he's very specific about the various sub-appellations in Bordeaux as to the qualities they bring to the table and the earthiness of certain regions versus others. But then inside of that, you have your climate issues and your terroir issues for that vintage, which is why we talk about how long it takes to understand an area. It says here in 22, did you have frost in 2022?
There was some, but no, we were okay. So I think we had a couple of nights where, obviously, I think the definition as such of frost is when it goes below zero, or and there is some sort of freezing as such. But for vines to be severe negatively impacted, I think that it needs to go to -2 and -3, and for more than a couple of hours. And it's always a bit touch and go, in April, because of obviously the early flowering. But yeah, I think there was a couple of days where it did go below zero post-April, and as I say, but because we're slightly higher up, and the frost does tend to go to the lower areas, you basically get patches of frozen fog which go to lower ground, which are more dangerous and can really do severe damage.
Interesting.
There can be a variation of sort of 3-4 degrees just by going down a sort of 10 to 20 meter hill. So in that respect, again, as I say, we're fairly lucky. I mean, we don't have any of the sort of modern technology. We can't afford any of the wind turbines or even the candles, because those candles, we've got 20 hectares of land, which is a large slice, and to buy 20 hectares worth of candles costs a lot of money, and then you've got to light them all, and then you're not now. So to have one lot of candles is all very well, but it could actually, you could get freezing conditions for 3 nights. So you basically need 3 lots, a supply of 3 days worth of candles if you're going down that candle route. So you need to buy almost 60 hectares worth of candles for our plot of land.
And now there's this discussion of, those smudge pots or candles, we're going to call them, are not good for the environment and climate change, blah, 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 blah.
It's fanning the flames, isn't it? It's sort of that whole dancing around a volcano thing, whereby, we're fighting climate change and uncommon frost by putting more carbon in the air. It just seems insane. So no, we didn't do anything. I would eventually like to put some wind turbines on, but they cost quite a lot of money. We're not there yet.
We were looking at a house in a little house in Yountville in Napa, and I'm like, I want to get one, that's next to a vineyard. I don't want to own the vineyard. I don't want to make wine, but maybe if it happens that this little house has got a view of a vineyard, it'd be great. And we found one, and when we went to go look at it, this giant turbine is right outside the patio. And they're not quiet, right? So I'm like, I think we're going to buy this one. But interesting problem, and this, I don't talk about politics on the show about why there's climate change, but there is climate change. And here's my only political innuendo, and that is Frederic Barnier from Louis Jadot was in. We were talking about the 2022 vintage. They had put smudge pots all over, and this is where that concept of air pollution came into the conversation. But at the same time, they had a frost right around bud break. It was a little late, right? What's that, May? And in the meantime, in fact, I'm going to have dinner with the couple that wrote the book Wine and War when we were in Paris. And they talk about frost or hail in Burgundy in 1940, like the worst vintage ever because it stripped the vines of the berries. This is 1940, long before all this discussion about climate change and problem. We're talking June as a hailstorm.
In 1940?
Excuse me?
In 1940, that was...
Yeah, 1940.
Yeah. Right, wow, yeah.
Long before we talked about this stuff.
Yeah, and I think hail's been an issue for a long time, but climate change. The most obvious sign of climate change for me is the alcoholic volumes. I look back through our catalogue of stocks. We bought a lot of the older stocks with property, and basically, everything from the late 90s is 12 to 12.5%. From 0 to 10 is 13%. From 10 to 15 is 13.5%.
Really?
And from 15 onwards is 14 to 14.5%. It's gone up half a degree per 5 years, I guess. I mean, it's gone up 2 degrees in 25 years.
Is that more challenging for a smaller, here you're talking about the budgets for things like, candles and wind turbines. And here we have this, obvious, I think it's throughout the world. I think every vineyard is wrestling with it. Some parts of the world are more affected than others. Certainly Bordeaux is. But does that put that much more pressure on a smaller vineyard and winery like yours?
No, I think honestly now, unless things will obviously get worse, but I think last year was considered really extreme. I don't think it will be considered extreme anymore, in that we were sort of up. We had 15, 20 days above 40 degrees. I think it's going to be like that this year. I think it's probably going to be like that next year. It's going to get worse, but it just means that we will be harvesting earlier and earlier, and instead of harvesting. In 2003, has still been the earliest historical harvest. And 2003 was an anomaly as such, in it being such a very hot year. But basically 18, 19 and 20 and 22 have been similar to that. And it just means that you instead of harvesting at the end of September, you harvest at the beginning of September. And again, I could be completely wrong about it, but what the winemaker wants is perfectly ripe fruit, and we're just going to hopefully get perfectly ripe fruit that bit earlier, at least for the next 10 years. So it shouldn't be that much of a problem. It will just mean that we will have to harvest end of August, I guess, mid of August, I don't know. But no, obviously, at some point, the Merlot, it will become potentially, 40, 42, 45, and people will be planting Syrah, or people will have stopped drinking by then. But I think for the moment, we're okay, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Wouldn't you be intrigued to go back 50 years, 100 years, even 2000, and see those grapes and taste those grapes on the vine and compare them to today's grapes and to the phenolic ripeness of the grapes, just to see how much they've changed? Or is this sort of a timeless thing? And because I always wonder what the objective is. Obviously, we want more palatable wine, better wine. But when do we say, this is the perfect wine for what it is? Or it's just a timeless challenge, and you are the steward of the land currently, and the next group gets it.
I think this is the golden age. I think in terms of people talk about 47 and 59 and 61 and 82s and these big ripe great vintages, but for the moment at least, we're getting these big ripe great vintages every year. As I say, we got 15, 16, 18, 19, 20, 22. That's 6 or so years out of 8 that have been great vintages. And previously, these great vintages came by. And what I mean by a great vintage again is a vintage whereby we achieved, and everyone achieved, full ripeness and great concentration. But now they're coming around once, as I say, 8 times in 10 as such. And somehow the Bordeaux still seem to claim it's the best vintage ever, which is rather than just, I guess I don't know much about Napa Valley vintages, but you don't have that much vintage variation.
Not
in Napa, do you? It's less of a thing, and I think it's going to be less of a thing in Bordeaux as well. That all vintages are going to be pretty decent, and that should, obviously ease pricing, because previously, again, these great vintages, the 2009s when they came out, and the 2010s were like, this is that vintage of a lifetime, and prices went up by 50%, which was just, no good for anyone apart from the chateau owner. And even for them, it didn't make much financial sense, because it just created uncertainty and volatility in the markets. So nowadays, hopefully, at least for the next, short term at least, there should be some stability and understanding that ripeness can be achieved every year.
It's interesting comment, because I do deal with this in my own mind on a regular basis, on the commercialism of wine versus the proper glass, like I said, the honest glass of wine. And so when I was podcasting up in Napa a few weeks ago, and I stumbled across this young man. He's making these incredible wines on a bootstrap. He's just passionately in love with the subject. He doesn't have a lot of money, and he's sourcing his grapes and making wines in a winery, and very philosophical approach to what he's doing. But the other night we had dinner with some friends at a restaurant I hadn't been to in a long time. I won't name any names, and he brought a bottle of one of the great, well-known Napa Cabs. I mean, everybody knows this wine. And he poured it in the glass, the Somme, and it was, it's certainly obviously very palatable and very good, but kind of represents this sort of latest opulent, fruit-forward, maybe there's a little RS in there, I don't know, maybe a little sugar, but just this almost unterroir-related wine. And then the owner of the restaurant's a good friend of mine. I said, bring me the list. And there was a Chateau, it was Chateau Lalande, but it was a Old Medoc, I believe. And it was fabulous. And so they poured it in the glass, and I didn't feel bad for the guy because he doesn't know any different, but what a structural difference in the wines. Same vintage, actually. Just completely different. And it was clear that this Bordeaux was carrying with it its history, its structure, the knowledge of the winemaker, the knowledge of the area. And I'm hoping that we can move, as with your wines, to the consumer to be able to identify these things and look that glass and say, this has got some pretty cool stuff in it.
Yeah, and as I say, I go back to the word singularity, which for me really does mean something that can be defined by its place and where it's from, and isn't just exactly that, just a very ripe, very well made Merlot or Bordeaux blend, and it's that I think is interesting for the consumer. Especially if it means that you're not, especially if you're also not paying, again, silly amounts of money for the wine, because wine is a product. Wine is something that should be affordable. Wine is something that shouldn't be exclusive. It shouldn't exclude people by price. It should be something that's that's sort of available to all as such, really, in an ideal world.
You have plans to be in California in the next couple of years?
My brother lives in Santa Barbara, so I am hoping to come over sooner rather than later. I've got a very good friend in Los Angeles as well, and I've been over sort of 2 or 3 times in the last 5 years, and I've got to get over again. I'd love to. It's a wonderful part of the world.
I'd love to have you. I'd love just if you keep me posted. We're in Napa quite a bit. There's there's a gal up there, Sharon Kazan, which is short for Kazanjian Harris. She owns a brand called Rare Cat, and she pours Bordeaux that she sources in her tasting room downtown Napa.
Right.
And she's a fabulous woman, knowledgeable, philosophical. She lives on Highway 29, and it just intrigues me that there's somebody pouring Bordeaux right there alongside all the rest of the Napa cabs. And we would have such a good time together to have dinner and share stories with her. Particularly, she's considers herself Bordelaise. So
she only pours Bordeaux, or she pours a bit of every. Napa
no, she also makes Napa cabs, but she sent.
Oh, she makes okay.
She sent me both, and they're both excellent. And in fact, I think you'd find we have a chance to taste together that her Bordeaux's. Her Napa cabs are Bordeaux-esque. In other words, they have that structure, that acid structure that she is not making the opulent Napa flavor. So next time you're in town, we'll figure that out. It's already been an hour, if you can believe it. It's been a fabulous conversation. And I will get you information on our trip to see if we can have time to break bread and have lunch or have a glass of wine.
That'd
or
be
something.
Great. Do you know where you're staying at? You send me details.
Yeah, we're staying at Maison Delano. It's on the border of this 1st and 8th district.
Right. Okay. Don't know, but I mean, Paris is small. That's another reason I love it. It's easy to walk around. It's easy to get around. It's easy to meet up.
We are going to visit Monsieur Williamson at Willie's Wine Bar.
Oh, well, I'll meet you there if you want.
That'd be a lot of fun to do that.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. I've got a small wine bar in Paris as well called Le Garde-Robe, which is a lovely natural wine bar. I'm a sleeping partner there, but there's a wonderful.
I'll have to visit that for sure.
In the first, yeah. Okay.
I'll send you an email. We'll go over the details and we'll hook up somehow.
Excellent.
Appreciate the time today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for speaking with me and getting me on the show. It's great.
Cheers and good luck.
Thanks a lot. Cheers, Paul.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Wine Talks with Paul Canon. Don't forget to subscribe because there's more great interviews on their way. Folks, have a great time out there in the wine world. Cheers.